In this video, we are going to have a look at the Laowa 50mm f2.8 2x macro lens and see if it could be the best macro lens for the micro four thirds cameras. Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to have a look at another lens from Laowa. This time it is the 50mm f2.8 2x macro lens for micro four thirds cameras. This 50mm macro lens from Laowa is quite interesting for two reasons. The first one is that this is a 2x macro lens. Compared to most other macro lenses currently available for micro four thirds cameras, they are mostly just up to 1x magnification. For example, I have the Olympus 60mm f2.8 macro. Probably one of the most popular macro lens for micro four thirds camera right now, and this is only up to 1x, while the Laowa is up to 2x maximum magnification. And if you look at the size, if I put them side by side, you see that despite the focal length is very similar, one is 50mm, one is 60mm, and they have the same maximum aperture, they are both f2.8. The Laowa is actually quite a bit smaller than the Olympus, despite that the Laowa has 2x magnification while Olympus is only 1x, and at the same time the Laowa still can focus to infinity. So if you want, you can use the Laowa lens to shoot landscape or portrait or any kind of normal photos, which is pretty much the same as the Olympus lens as well. If you have never used a 2x macro lens before and wondering what's the difference between what you can capture with a normal 1x macro lens and the 2x macro lens, this is a quick example to show you the difference. This photo I shot at 1x magnification, and this is the photo that I shot at approximately 2x magnification. If you look at them side by side, you can see there is definitely a big difference between what you can capture with a 2x macro lens. And the second interesting thing is, while Laowa has already released quite a number of micro four thirds lenses previously, this is the first lens that they released after they officially joined the micro four thirds system standard. And what that means is, instead of like the older Laowa micro four thirds lenses, which is purely mechanical lens, there's no electronic components, there's no electronic contacts at all on the lens. This time, if you look at the rear mount of the lens, you can see there is the electronic contacts here, which means when you mount it onto a micro four thirds camera, the lens actually would transmit a lot of information back to the camera. So when you take a photo, you can see what sort of lenses you are using to shoot the photo, you can see the focal length, you can see the aperture that you chose, and that also means the IBIS on your camera can work properly without you having to manually set the focal length, because the camera can know what is the focal length of the lens automatically. And you may notice that there is no more aperture ring on the lens anymore, because just like most of the native micro four thirds lenses, you can now just use the dial on your camera to adjust the aperture when you're shooting. You no longer have to just manually, mechanically set the aperture on the lens. And when you stop down the lens, the aperture also wouldn't just stop down all the time when you are framing the photos. So that will make it easier for you to adjust the focus, because you'll be previewing with the more shallow depth of field. But if you want, you can still use the camera's depth of field preview function to stop down the lens so that you can preview the actual depth of field with the aperture that you select accurately when you are framing the photos. And another benefit now with the electronic contacts is, as soon as you turn the manual focus ring on the lens, the camera would immediately know that you are adjusting the focus, and it will give you that zoom in view for you to adjust the focus very accurately and also very easily. Compared to the other lenses that doesn't have the electronic contacts, including the older Laowa lenses, those lenses, if you want to do that, you have to assign that zoom in function to one of the customizable buttons, so that you have to manually trigger it every time before you start the manual focus, and then you have to press a button to reset it back to the normal view after you finish it, which is something I kind of get used to over the years while using all the different Laowa lenses and other lenses that doesn't have the electronic contacts. But after shooting with this 50mm Laowa macro lens, it just a lot easier when the camera does all the thing automatically for you. So when I switch back to some of the other lenses that doesn't have the electronic contacts, it just feels a lot more different. This 50mm Laowa macro lens just feels so much easier to use compared to those other lenses. However, probably because this is the first Laowa lens that they released after joining the Micro Four Thirds system, and also this is a very early pre-production sample that Laowa sent to me for this review. There are a couple of glitches and small issues that I noticed with this lens when I'm trying to adjust the main focus or the aperture. I talked to Laowa about that and they are aware of the problems. They told me that most of the issues will be fixed by the time that they release the final production version. But there is one thing that they probably won't fix, is that when you're adjusting the focus ring, the camera will automatically pop up that zoom in view, and you can also enable that focus distance scale so that you can see what sort of focus distance that you are setting to on the lens from infinity to the macro side. Usually when you are changing that scale would update pretty much instantly to tell you what the setting currently is. But with this Laowa lens, no matter what I set the focus distance to, the scale remains unchanged. I don't really know how many people actually rely on that focus distance scale to help them when they're doing manual focus. Myself, I never really use that to help me. I just look at the screen and I just turn the ring and just see how the picture changes. That is enough for me. But yeah, this is one of the issues that I found. I report to Laowa and they told me this is something that they probably won't fix even for the production version. But apart from that, shooting with this Laowa lens feels pretty much exactly the same as if I'm shooting with a native Olympus or Panasonic Micro Four Thirds lens. I really like the fact that I can now control the aperture from the camera directly, so that the camera can control the aperture for me. It doesn't stop down all the time, and also when I look at the photo, I can see what is the exact aperture I chose when I shoot a particular photo. The build quality of this lens is very good. It feels solid, it feels metal, and it's also very compact, as I mentioned before. If I compare these two lenses side by side, the weight of these two lenses is pretty much the same, but Laowa is quite a bit smaller. The manual focus ring feels pretty smooth. The focus travel throw is around 160 degrees, which is not super long for a lens with 2x macro magnification, but because it is all done by mechanically, not by wire, so it is pretty easy for you to do a very accurate, precise focus even when you are taking macro photos. It is an internal focus lens, so the total length of the lens doesn't change when you are changing focus. If you look inside the lens, you may see that there is a group of elements that would move together when you are changing the focus distance. When the focus is set to infinity, those group of elements would move to the rear of the lens, and as you try to focus to a closer distance, then the whole group of elements would start to move forward near the front of the lens. So when you set to 2x magnification, then the whole group of elements would now be at the very front of the lens. Okay, next let's have a look at the image quality of this 50mm macro lens from Laowa, and I'm also going to do a bit of comparison with the Olympus 60mm macro lens. As I mentioned before, this is probably one of the most popular macro lens for the Micro Four Thirds shooters, and they have pretty similar specs. The focal length is very similar. They are both f2.8. The price of the Olympus lens at the time I'm doing this review is $499, and the Laowa 50mm macro lens, I was told the retail price will be $399. So that means the Laowa lens will be around $100 cheaper than the Olympus lens. But let's have a look and see how is the image quality is like when you compare them side by side. Okay, first let's look at some of the macro photo I shot at approximately 1x magnification. With the Laowa lens, when I shoot at the maximum aperture, the sharpness is already very good. So even when I stop down to f4, the sharpness actually doesn't change too much, because the sharpness was already very good at f2.8. And if I compare it with the Olympus, I would say the sharpness is also very similar. The Olympus also is very sharp even at the maximum aperture. So I think the image quality from both lenses at 1x magnification is very similar. Let's have a look at the image sharpness at 2x magnification. At f2.8, the image sharpness is pretty okay. If you stop down to f4, then the image sharpness would become quite a bit better, and at f5.6, then the image sharpness become really good. But I think the biggest problem if you want to shoot at f2.8 is that at 2x magnification, the depth of field is super narrow. So it's actually quite hard to nail the focus if you want to shoot at f2.8. And next, let's have a look at the image sharpness when I use these two lenses to shoot some photo at a non-macro distance. If you look at the center sharpness with the Laowa lens at f2.8, the center sharpness is pretty good, very decent. If I stop down to f4, the image sharpness would improve marginally, but overall I think most people would be happy even if you are shooting at the maximum aperture. And if you compare it with the Olympus, I think the center sharpness is very similar with these two lenses when you are shooting at the same aperture setting. The Laowa's corner sharpness is also very good even when you are shooting at the maximum aperture. Stop down to f4 or 5.6 will only improve the corner sharpness a little bit. Compare it with the Olympus, again I think the corner sharpness of these two lenses are very similar if you are shooting at the same aperture setting. So overall I think the image sharpness of these two lenses are both very good and also very similar, and most people should be pretty happy even if you are shooting at the maximum aperture. In terms of distortion, this one is a little bit strange because when I shot all those brick wall test photo with the Laowa lens, I don't really notice much distortion at all. Distortion is very well controlled when I shoot at a few different distance. But then when I look at the real world sample photo that I shot with the Laowa lens, I do notice there is definitely a bit of distortion, some of them quite noticeable in my real world test photos. So yeah, it's a bit strange. I think what happens is with the Laowa lens, if your focus distance is somewhere very close to up to a couple meters away, there is not much distortion at all in the photos. But once you set the focus distance to a bit further away, like 20 meters or so, or even further away, then you would notice there would be a bit of distortion with the photos that captured by the Laowa lens. With the Olympus lens, distortion is very well controlled. No matter you are shooting close subject or very far away subject, distortion is always very well controlled. So if you're someone who want to use this lens to do a bit of architectural kind of landscape photos, then the Laowa probably is not the best choice for you. The Laowa has very minimal amount of vignetting even when I was shooting photo at the maximum aperture. If I stop down to f4, then virtually there's no noticeable vignetting. With the Olympus lens, vignetting is also very similar to the Laowa lens. If you compare the photo shot at the same aperture setting, I would say maybe the Olympus is marginally better than the Laowa at the same aperture setting, but that is only if you put some controlled photo side by side, then you may notice some tiny amount of difference. But when you are taking real world photos, I don't think anyone would notice any vignetting even when you are shooting at the maximum aperture. Chromatic aberration is also very well controlled by both these lenses. When I look at all the real world sample photo that I shot with these two lenses, I don't see much color fringing at all. And even when I look at this set of test photos that I shot at the maximum aperture, when I first look at these test photos, I also don't really notice any color fringing at all. But when I zoom in the photos, then I notice there is a little bit of color fringing with the photo that I shot with the Olympus lens, while with the Laowa lens, even when I'm looking at 100% or 200% zoom, I see virtually no color fringing at all, even the photo I shot at f2.8, so that is definitely very impressive. Next, let's compare the out of focus area, the bokeh from these two lenses. At the maximum aperture f2.8, the bokeh from the Laowa appears to be a bit rounder and also cleaner. And also if you look at the fall off at the edge of the bokeh, the Laowa seems to have a smoother fall off if you compare it to the Olympus. When I stop down to f4, bokeh from the Olympus lens still remain relatively round, but bokeh from the Laowa suddenly turn into a heptagon shape. Now, while the bokeh from the Laowa is still probably smoother than the Olympus, but at the f4 setting, I probably prefer the bokeh from the Olympus a little bit more just because it has a little bit more rounded edges. When I stop down to f5.6, the bokeh from Olympus also start to turn into a heptagon shape. It might be still slightly more round compared to the Laowa, but the difference is not really big at f5.6. When I stop down to f8 or smaller aperture, the shape of the bokeh from both lenses are pretty much the same. They both are heptagon shaped bokeh. But overall, I think I would prefer the bokeh from the Laowa a little bit more because the bokeh from the Laowa just looks slightly smoother, cleaner, and just a little bit more pleasant to my eyes. Lens flare is usually not a big concern for macro photography, but if you want to use these lenses to shoot a bit of portrait or landscape, then you may notice the Olympus has better lens flare control compared to the Laowa. Both lenses has pretty decent lens flare control, but when there is a very bright light source in front of the camera, you may notice with the Laowa lens, the ghosting may be a bit more noticeable compared to the Olympus. In the past, when I was reviewing some other macro lenses that can do more than 1x magnification, I quite often got asked the question is whether you can do handheld macro photos at more than 1x magnification without using a tripod, and it is quite a tricky question to answer because it really depends on so many things. But it is possible, it is definitely possible. But first thing is you definitely need to have a lot of light. So if you are taking photo during the middle of the day, even without dedicated macro flash or any other extra lighting, it is definitely still possible, but you would have to bump up the ISO quite a bit and also rely on the camera's IBIS, in-body image stabilization, to help you to minimize any amount of blur that is possible. And I also would advise you to shoot in burst mode so that it would take a couple of shots, because when you are taking photos at 2x magnification, the distance between your camera and the subject is very close. So any amount of camera movement or your subject move a little bit could make your photo completely unusable. If you shoot in burst mode and just take a couple of shots in a row, that would greatly increase the chance for you to get some nice sharp photos when you are shooting at such a close focus distance and high magnification. So the short answer is yes, it's definitely doable, but you have to make sure you have lots of light when you are taking macro photo at more than 1x magnification. In terms of image quality, I think overall these two lenses are both very similar and they are both excellent. The Olympus is better in some area, for example the lens flare control and also the distortion when you are shooting subject that is far away, while the Laowa has slightly cleaner bokeh and also it has very impressive chromatic aberration control. I mean, look at that test photo I shot. It's a black and white high contrast test chart, and that photo I shot at f2.8, there is virtually no chromatic aberration. So overall, I think if you really have to choose between one of these two lenses, I feel it's not that much to do with the image quality, because the image quality of these two lenses are both excellent and very similar overall. I think the biggest factor to choose between these two lenses is the fact that the Olympus, it does have autofocus. It has the switch here that allow you to limit the focus to some certain focus distance, and it also has a little bit less distortion when you are shooting far away objects. So if you want to buy a more like a general purpose lens that you can shoot everything from macro to people that is moving around and also a bit of architectural thing, then The Olympus probably is the better choice because it has the autofocus and has less distortion. But on the other hand, the Laowa, because it can go up to 2 times magnification, and that is something most of the macro lens in the market can't do, including this Olympus lens, and you can still focus to infinity. And the fact that now it has the electronic context support, that means the iBurst, the EXIF data, and the automatically pop up the zoom in view when you are changing the focus, make this third-party macro lens feel pretty much just like a lens from Panasonic or Olympus. So if you are someone who want to get a lens that is mainly for macro photos and occasionally use it for a bit of other like a portrait or a bit of landscape photos, I feel the Laowa lens would probably be the better choice because the ability to shoot macro photo at up to 2 times magnification does open up a lot more possibility if you want to focus on macro photography. Thank you very much for watching this review. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you have any questions about this Laowa lens, please drop a comment below.